I wasn't supposed to speak of this. Not to anyone. The official files claim we were conducting standard reconnaissance of abandoned Soviet installations, monitoring thermal anomalies, and verifying structural integrity for potential NATO use. That's the cover story. What I remember the real truth is buried beneath layers of ice, metal, and something else, something patient. We arrived under polar night, temperatures registering -43°C. Wind chill drove straight through my parka and Kevlar, cracking ears and teeth alike. I remember the silence first, not the kind of silence that's merely absence of sound, but one that seems to hold its own weight, pressing against your lungs. Boots crunching over permafrost sounded hollow, as if the snow itself were listening. Base frost line, as NATO called it, had been abandoned for decades, yet the generators hummed. Lights flickered sporadically, casting shadows that bent at impossible angles. Thermometers fluctuated without pattern. GPS coordinates occasionally shifted by kilometers hour. Compasses spun like marionettes with frayed strings. I remember the first glimpse. A reinforced hatch buried under ice, adorned with a symbol I had never seen before. It glowed faintly, a sickly green phosphorescence that seemed alive. I traced it with my gloved finger. The air felt viscous, thick as syrup, and my lungs burned. I tried to speak, but only rasping static escaped. My team didn't notice, at least not then. Even now, in this room, recounting it under oath, the memory presses against my chest. Something watched us, waiting, not from shadows, from the spaces between shadows. And we had no idea how deep it ran. By the time we were cleared for insertion, rationality was a fragile veneer. Everything beyond that hatch was classified, and for good reason. The briefing was sterile, clinical, delivered by officers who smiled too little and asked questions that never had answers. They spoke of containment protocols, risk mitigation, and unverified anomalies. I wish they'd been honest. Frostline had been a Soviet deep research outpost, officially decommissioned in 1979 after a series of structural failures and environmental hazards. What intelligence reports failed to mention, or perhaps deliberately omitted, was the underground sublevel. Designated level Delta to 9. Sensors recorded irregular radiation spikes, subsonic hums, and inexplicable thermal fluxes. Satellite imagery suggested a cavernous network beneath the ice, but all direct reconnaissance ended in anomalous equipment failures. Our mission, under joint Mossad-NATO oversight, was ostensibly simple: confirm the presence of subterranean structures, document environmental conditions, and report any recoverable technological assets. But from the first briefing, I knew there was more. Officers spoke in euphemisms: containment studies, unclassified anomalies, preventive observation. Each term felt carefully selected to veil the truth. Something had been awakened or discovered beneath the Arctic ice. Team insertion was critical. The Soviets had employed the site for experiments that blurred physics, chemistry, and, if rumors were true, enchant, ritualized engineering. Logs mentioned temporal displacement, dimensional variance, and adaptive consciousness. Signatures. None of this appeared in the official debrief. I noted it in my personal log, knowing that a direct report would vanish. Command emphasized containment. Frostline was no longer just a base, it was a threshold. Should the subterranean anomaly breach, the risk extended beyond national borders. Operational protocol required minimal personnel exposure, full communications blackout during insertion, and immediate extraction if environmental readings exceeded set thresholds. Every precaution underscored a single unspoken fact: the facility did not belong entirely to the physical world we understood. Our mission was to verify, observe, and survive, though survival was already a fragile promise. The stakes were explicit. Failure meant more than death. It meant exposure to a force ungoverned by human understanding. And yet we were ordered to descend. We were 6 on the ground team, a hand-picked group trained for extreme conditions, technical expertise, and operational secrecy. Each one carried not only their gear, but a personal history that would later haunt the mission logs. Commander Aitin Barak rank, Captain, at. Veteran of counterintelligence and Arctic operations. Rational, unshakable, under fire, and disciplined to the point of obsession. Even in the briefing room, his presence was a stabilizing force. He monitored readings and recalculated risk faster than any computer in the base. I trusted him until the anomalies began rewriting the logic he relied on. Medic Dr. Yael Misrahi, calm, analytical, meticulous. Years of experience with hypothermic casualties and biochemical emergencies. She carried her kit in a custom insulated case and noted oxygen saturation with near-ritual precision. Yael's mind was like a lattice, orderly, predictable, resistant. I'd watch her later, struggling to reconcile symptoms that had no medical explanation. Demolitions expert, Avi Sparks Cohen, reckless brilliance. Years in sabotage units and improvised demolition, always pushing limits for precision and speed. His kit was custom, lined with redundancies, and his humor was sharp enough to cut ice. Sparks would later become grotesquely different, but even then, no one anticipated the speed at which the base itself seemed to reshape him. Communications specialist Liar Tall, analytical to a fault, obsessive about signal integrity. Carried portable frequency analyzers, encryption devices, and a personal log of ambient frequencies that bordered on the obsessive. Liar often whispered about messages in the background noise, and I dismissed it as paranoid till the base itself began speaking through him. Veteran leader Dav Levin, senior enlisted operative, decades in Arctic and subterranean operations. Calm, commanding, steady. He had the sort of memory that stitched together operational history into immediate tactical advantage. I admired him for his reliability until the anomalies erased the very fabric of his recollection. Leaving a shell obeying orders with no context, myself, redacted Lieutenant Mossad. Field reconnaissance, survival operations, liaison with NATO and Arctic Command.
My role was to observe, document, and survive.
I carried a standard kit, recording equipment, personal logs that would later contradict themselves, or be contradicted by the world. Individually, we were competent. Collectively, we were a machine calibrated for precision and endurance. Each carried an unspoken understanding. Arctic environments are merciless, but the base below Frostline would be more merciless still. Even before deployment, subtle frictions appeared. Liar occasionally froze mid-step, listening to frequencies inaudible to others. Sparks hummed to himself while checking charges like counting ghosts in the shadows. Yael's eyes lingered too long on the flickering lights, noting odd patterns in reflection. The commander noticed, but said nothing. There were orders, schedules, risks, higher than curiosity. I logged it all. The small, uneasy vibrations at the edge of perception would later escalate into a symphony of impossible horror. Each of us would pay a different price, and none of us would leave unchanged. Briefing took place in Sector Command's sub-level. Stark chamber with steel walls and an array of screens projecting schematics, environmental readouts, and satellite imagery. The officers spoke in clipped tones, their voices echoing off the metal like gunfire in a tunnel. No theatrics, no embellishments. It's just data and an unspoken weight pressing on everyone present. Primary objective: confirm structural integrity of Frostline subterranean level Delta to 9. Secondary objective: record environmental anomalies. Collect any Soviet-era equipment with potential intelligence value. Contingency: evacuation within 45 minutes if oxygen, radiation, or temporal fluctuation thresholds exceeded. We were provided with gear to survive Arctic extremes and, ostensibly, to defend against unforeseen threats. Standard loadouts included insulated Kevlar suits, rebreather units, portable thermal mapping, MP-hardened coms, and modular sensor arrays. Each operative carried secondary kits, explosives, medical triage, signal analyzers. Even with redundancies, every officer knew nothing in the training manuals covered what we were about to encounter. The insertion plan was straightforward. Reach the Frostline perimeter by snowcat convoy, and transfer to tracked submersibles to traverse glacial fissures. Final descent through the hatch at the frozen surface would be by modular lift, equipped with sensors to record anomalies. Standard protocol dictated to points of egress, redundant life support, and continuous telemetry back to base. At the briefing, Commander Barak emphasized caution. "This is reconnaissance, not engagement," he said. Yet the subtext was clear. The base was unpredictable. Liar adjusted cum frequencies obsessively, murmuring about background signals the officers pretended not to hear. Sparks checked charges repeatedly, as if imagining potential breaches that no one had outlined. Yale annotated oxygen and pressure readings with meticulous detail, her hand steady, but her gaze flicking toward shadows that weren't there, at least, not yet. Deployment began in near-total darkness. Aurora Borealis painted the horizon with faint alien greens, echoing the color of the symbols on the hidden hatch. Snowcats creaked, gears whining against the cold. Communication was limited to encrypted pulses. Every sound metal on ice, breathing, rebreather, his was amplified in the Arctic void. As we approached Frostline, the first anomalies became impossible to ignore. GPS coordinates fluctuated. Sensors recorded brief, inexplicable drops in gravity. Liar whispered about entropy pulses, the kind that could, theoretically, disrupt spatial perception. Commander Barak dismissed it as interference. I logged it anyway. By the time we reached the frozen hatch, the wind had dropped, leaving an oppressive silence that pressed against our eardrums. The lift descended into the unknown. Lights flickered along the shaft, and I thought I saw shapes moving in the walls themselves. Rationality still held, but unease had begun to settle, slow and insistent, like ice forming beneath skin. The hatch yawned beneath the Arctic night, a gaping mouth of steel and ice. Our modular lift descended slowly, cables groaning under the weight of frost and tension. The interior walls of the shaft were slick, metallic, yet with faint striations lines that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. Sparks swore under his breath, adjusting explosive stabilizers as if the metal itself might shift or rebel. Inside the lift, oxygen meters flickered erratically, registering short dips even though the system's output remained nominal. Yawel frowned, tapping her console. "Nothing's wrong with the unit," she said, voice calm but tight. "Still, saturation is dropping brief, microsecond dips." Commander Barak dismissed it with a nod, eyes scanning thermal overlays. I didn't feel reassured. The descent took longer than expected, though. Readings suggested only 30 meters traversed. Time itself seemed dilated. Liar whispered about signal echoes, the kind that suggested a corridor stretching far longer than its physical dimensions. I caught the faint hum, barely audible, a resonance that vibrated in the chest, like the base itself exhaling. We arrived at level Delta 29. The air thickened immediately, metallic on the tongue, pressing against lungs like a vice. The lift doors opened with a hiss, revealing a corridor that should have been straight, but bent subtly, impossibly. Light emitted from overhead fluorescents, yet shadows shifted against the logic of physics. I remember thinking the corridor is alive before I dismissed it as fatigue. Sparks led the advance, breaching the first door with modular charges. The blast echoed strangely, long after it should have dissipated. Walls vibrated with subsonic murmurs, almost imperceptible chanting that the lift's audio monitors initially recorded as interference. Liar froze mid-step, raising a gloved hand. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. The others shook their heads. I did. We pressed forward. Sensors recorded temperature drops, yet heat signatures flickered along the wall shapes that resembled figures but rearranged themselves when observed directly. Yael checked vitals. Pulses accelerated, blood pressure rose, yet none of us had exerted ourselves. Commander Barak tightened his jaw, but continued forward, keeping formation. At each junction, the corridor seemed to lengthen, the walls stretching imperceptibly. Doors we passed minutes before reappeared around corners we hadn't yet reached. Time and space no longer aligned. Sparks muttered about topological anomalies, but his words sounded like a joke even to him. We reached a wide chamber, central to the base's lower level. Symbols matching those on the frozen hatch above glowed faintly along the floor and walls. The glyphs pulsed in unison with the hum, vibrating beneath boots, like a heartbeat of the facility. Liar approached cautiously, scanner in hand. The readings were nonsensical. Energy fluctuations, gravity distortions, radiation spikes, all simultaneous and defying known physics. I remember the silence most vividly. Not mere absence of sound, but a presence that filled every crevice, every corner. Even Sparks stopped humming to himself. Yael's hands trembled slightly as she recorded data. The commander's eyes narrowed, scanning, calculating. And somewhere behind the layers of perception, I felt the first deliberate watching, a consciousness older than the ice, patient, aware. We were still within what should have been the normal operational corridor. By the time we had advanced only 50 meters, I knew rationality was slipping. The Arctic outside had nothing on the weight pressing in from below. And yet we continued. Mission dictated forward. Curiosity, hubris, or protocol, perhaps all three propelled us toward what lay beneath. We crossed the threshold into the heart of level Delta 29, leaving the lift shaft and corridors behind. The chamber we entered defied expectation. Ceilings arched impossibly high, yet angles were acute enough to make the room feel claustrophobic. Our lights headlamps, portable illuminators, flickered against walls that weren't entirely walls. Surfaces seemed to ripple, momentarily soft like liquid, then snap back to solid steel. The temperature fluctuated in ways that sensors could not rationalize. One moment, our breath crystallized. The next, condensation formed on walls, as if the air were warmer than measured. Liar adjusted his frequency analyzers. The readings screamed anomalies, signals bending in spaces our maps insisted did not exist. The hum persisted, low and rhythmic, vibrating in bone and marrow. Commander Barak led methodically. "Stick to formation," he said, voice calm but clipped. "Record everything." Yet I noticed his eyes scanning angles no human should, corners where corridors shouldn't converge. Shadows that moved independently of our lights. Sparks murmured about structural stress, though his voice carried a nervous edge. Yael's oxygen meter dipped again, briefly unnaturally. "Air is fine, yet vitals spike," she noted. I recorded it silently. Even her precise mind seemed unsettled by these minor impossibilities. The chamber contained remnants of Soviet experimentation massive conduits. What looked like generators or dimensional stabilizers, etched with glowing glyphs identical to the hatch above. The symbols pulsed in sequences, synchronized with the low hum. When Liar moved closer, the hum intensified, vibrating through his bones. He froze mid-step, scanner trembling in gloved hands, and whispered, "It's live." I saw it too then, or perhaps I felt it. A presence threaded through the walls, the floor, the shadows. Its subtle at first, shapes shifting at the corner of vision, angles that bent without explanation but unmistakable. Sparks glanced at me, grinned tight, muttering that the walls seemed to breathe. I noted the phrase. Later it would be literal. We advanced cautiously. Footsteps echoed oddly, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, never consistent. Ya remarked the hum was affecting her balance, though the floor remained flat. Liar's devices began registering fluctuations in time perception. Brief lapses. Microseconds stretched into minutes, readings that made no sense. The commander didn't comment, only pressed forward, relying on instinct honed over years of Arctic operations. A doorway appeared triangular, not rectangular, its edges glowing faintly with the same phosphorescent glyphs. Sparks tested it with a small charge. The explosion was muted, then echoed long after the blast should have ended. The air thickened further, tasting metallic. I heard faint whispers, low in a language neither Liar nor I recognized.
Ow.
The whispers repeated our names, soft at first, then growing in cadence. Even rational minds began to fray. The chamber seemed larger than measured. Shadows cast by our lights twisted independently, falling against walls at angles that should have been impossible. My journal, still operational, flickered intermittently, text distorting as if written by multiple hands at once. By the time we were fully inside, the Arctic cold had become irrelevant. What pressed on us now was not frost or wind, but the environment itself. Living architecture, conscious, ancient, patient. Rational mission objectives were quickly losing meaning. Forward was no longer safe. It was necessary. Protocol demanded it. Survival demanded it. Curiosity, perhaps doomed it. For the next stretch, we attempted to operate normally. Cameras recorded structural layouts. Sensors mapped conduits and machinery. Yael monitored vitals and oxygen saturation. Liar calibrated frequencies. Sparks inspected the infrastructure for weaknesses, while Commander Barak kept formation tight, giving commands in precise increments. Yet even in routine, the base resisted logic. Hallways that should have been linear began to curve subtly. Doors reappeared behind us after we had already passed them. The hum of the base is persistent, almost musical vibration, pulsed in sync with no known frequency. Liar noted it, fingers flying over controls, muttering about background resonance that matched heartbeats in the walls. Small anomalies crept in, almost benign at first. Shadows lingered longer than their sources. Reflections in metallic surfaces sometimes moved independently, catching Sparks staring before snapping his gaze away. Yal's oxygen meter briefly displayed negative readings. Impossible by every standard we knew, then returned to normal with no explanation. We recorded everything meticulously, aware of our mandate to observe, not intervene. Yet the very act of observation seemed to alter perception. Time stretched inconsistently. A minute in one corridor became several in another. Our instruments occasionally contradicted each other, temperature, gravity, and radiation readings fluctuating simultaneously, yet in ways that made no sense. I remember walking past a large support pillar etched with glyphs. The symbol's glow shifted when I blinked, elongating like molten metal before snapping back. Sparks saw it too. He laughed nervously. Ha! Ice crystals playing tricks. But even as he said it, his boot slipped slightly over nothing, as if the floor had subtly warped. By mid-exploration, whispers began to thread through the silence. Not words, at least not in any language I recognized, but a cadence that suggested intent. The hum responded, rising and falling in harmony with our footsteps. Shadows elongated and contracted independently, seeming to anticipate movement. Liar stopped mid-step, facing a corner that had no observable opening. He swore he saw movement in the wall like a pulse, and for a heartbeat I believed him. Commander Barrack ordered a break, insisting we maintain protocols, recalibrate sensors, and log anomalies carefully. Everyone complied, but tension hung in the air, thick and metallic, pressing against our chests. Even rational minds began to stretch. This was the first realization. Frostline did not merely exist, it reacted, subtly, patiently, to our presence. By the end of the period designated as normal ops, we had gathered hundreds of terabytes of data, yet understanding eluded us. The base whispered, and even the most disciplined among us began to hear it. What we thought of as routine had already begun to warp perception, bending our minds toward something older, something patient, something not entirely human. It started almost imperceptibly, the sound of soft, deliberate tapicode down the corridor. Not a structural creak, not equipment settling, but intentional. Sparks swore it came from behind a wall that, according to schematics, didn't exist. We froze. Commander Barrack signaled silence. The tap repeated, irregular yet rhythmic. Liar adjusted his scanners. No movement detected. No pressure changes, he said, eyes wide. But the sound persisted, tapping against perception itself. It wasn't mechanical, it wasn't environmental. Something else was asserting presence. We continued forward cautiously. Then came the reflection anomaly. A corridor wall displayed our mirrored images, but for a fraction of a second, the reflections moved independently. Yal raised her hand. Sparks jerked his head, both recognizing the impossible. I recorded it, hands shaking slightly. The air shifted. Not temperature, not pressure, something subtler, denser. Breathing became laborious, and oxygen meters displayed false spikes. Readings of suffocation in one instant, normal in the next. The metallic taste in my mouth thickened, like iron dissolved into cold smoke. Then Liar's device emitted a soft pulse, unintelligible at first, then unmistakably patterned. A frequency repeating our names, whispered by something beyond the walls. Do you hear it? He asked, voice trembling. Yale nodded, silent eyes scanning glyphs that now glowed faintly in response to the sound. Sparks tried to laugh it off, stepping toward the wall. He froze mid-step. The tap escalated into a series of knocks, echoing from multiple directions simultaneously, impossible by any physics we knew. Commander Barrack drew his sidearm, scanning, but the source remained elusive. The corridor seemed to warp. Shadows stretched unnaturally, angles bending against light. Every instinct screamed retreat, yet mission protocol demanded forward observation. Rationality strained against sensory evidence. The base was alive and aware of us. For the first time, unease hardened into dread. Rational explanations, equipment malfunction, hypothermia. Stress felt increasingly insufficient. Whatever we had awakened or uncovered beneath the ice, it had noticed us. In that moment, each of us understood Frostline wasn't just a structure. It was an intelligence, patient, observant, indifferent to our presence, yet aware. We continued forward, recording every anomaly, each step heavier than the last. None of us spoke of fear. The hum of the bass had already begun to echo in our minds, and we sensed we were not alone. The corridor's rhythm had shifted. What began as subtle taps and reflective anomalies now commanded attention in every step. Shadows stretched like ink across the walls, moving independently of our lights, coiling around corners, vanishing when directly observed, only to reappear behind us. Sparks muttered that the floor had memory, referring to impressions of his boots that remained after the step was lifted. We traced them, footprints leading deeper into the corridor, vanishing into walls that should have been solid. None of us had left them. The thought hung in the air, metallic and sharp. Flickers of light punctuated the hum lamps, brightened and dimmed in patterns that seemed meaningful. Liar scanned them obsessively, recording frequency and intensity, muttering, "It's communicating," or testing. Yale checked vitals. Heart rates elevated, tremors in hands, subtle but undeniable. Oxygen remained normal. The body betrayed nothing, yet screamed internally. I noticed Commander Barak paused longer than usual, eyes scanning angles that no sensor or schematic could explain. He touched glyphs faintly etched along the walls. They pulsed faintly in response, not as decoration, but as if the base itself were aware of his touch. Then the whispers began, again soft, distant, repeating names, sometimes commands, sometimes questions. At first, we thought it environmental resonance, but the cadence was irregular, and occasionally the voice mimicked our speech patterns. Sparks froze mid-step, staring at a shadow that had lengthened, stretched, and split into impossible angles. We attempted a systematic sweep, mapping anomalies, recording everything, yet logic betrayed us. Liar's instruments contradicted themselves. Temperature, gravity, and electromagnetic fields fluctuated simultaneously, impossible by known physics. Time no longer felt linear. A step taken in one corridor felt like minutes had passed in another. Yale whispered, "It's aware of us." None of us argued. The metallic taste thickened in my mouth, a constant reminder that the air itself had changed. The hum pulsed with intent, rising and falling like a heartbeat. A shadow seemed to glance at us. Corners flickered into shapes resembling humanoids, then collapsed into void. For the first time, rationality wavered. None of us believed in the supernatural. We relied on protocols, sensors, and training. Yet here, beneath the ice, logic bent like the walls around us. Every step carried dread, every breath metallic, every shadow suspect. We pressed forward not from courage, but because the mission demanded it. Forward was mandated. Retreat was protocol violation. Yet even as we advanced, I sensed a truth we could not articulate. The base was learning us, shaping perception, testing our limits. And somewhere in the rhythm of shadows, flickers, and whispers, something waited, patient, indifferent, inevitable. We reached a junction where the corridor abruptly ended, opening into a vast chamber. The walls shimmered, their metallic surfaces bending light in ways that should have been impossible. Glyphs lined every angle, pulsating in rhythm with the base's omnipresent hum. The air was heavier now, thick with metallic taste and pressure against the chest, like the world itself had grown denser. It started as a shape. At first, peripheral and elongated silhouette, shifting at the edge of vision, indistinct. Sparks pointed, whispering, "Did you see that?" When we turned, it wasn't there. Yet the shadows in the chamber conformed, stretching unnaturally, as if drawing the outline of something that didn't belong. Then it moved into focus. The entity emerged, not fully corporeal, yet more than a shadow. Its form resembled a humanoid figure, tall and impossibly thin, but facets of it seemed to phase in and out of reality. Limbs stretched at angles no human anatomy could support. Eyes or eye-like voids glowed faintly green, reflecting the glyphs on the walls. Liar froze, scanner trembling. The hum in the chamber intensified, vibrating through his chest, resonating with the entity as if in conversation. Sparks backed away slowly, voice trembling. "It knows we're here." Yal's hand shook as she checked vitals. Oxygen appeared normal, but pulses raced, skin cold. The entity advanced, yet it did not move conventionally. The air around it warped. The floor beneath it seemed to ripple, bending space subtly, displacing shadows and altering perspectives. Commander Barak drew his sidearm, voice steady but low. Hold positions. Observe. Do not engage. It spoke, though not in sound. The frequency pulses from Lyre's devices aligned with a sudden surge in the chamber's electromagnetic field. The pattern was intelligible, not language, but communication, calling names, echoing thoughts, reading intent. The entity's presence projected itself into our perception. Manipulating sensory input, whispers became voices, shadows became grasping forms, glyphs pulsed in direct response to our gaze. I remember Spark screamed first, though no physical contact occurred. His reflection in a metallic panel elongated, multiplied, limbs twisting impossibly, and then snapped back, gasping, as if he had felt the deformation in his own body. Lyre muttered numbers and sequences, repeating patterns too complex to be humanly processed. The entity paused, observing us. Awareness radiated from it, patient, indifferent. Yell whispered, "It doesn't intend to destroy, at least not yet. But it calculates." The chamber seemed alive, responding to our every heartbeat. I could feel it thinking, weighing, assessing. I documented everything, my hands shaking. Rationality had fractured. Physics was unreliable. Perception itself was compromised. The entity remained tall and patient, a sentinel of impossible geometry, observing without hostility, yet compelling fear without malice. And then the realization struck. This was not a trap in the conventional sense. It didn't need to attack. It simply existed beyond comprehension, waiting for us to make errors, to unravel under the pressure of our own minds. We were not intruders. We were experiments. After the initial encounter, the chamber no longer felt inert. Each step, each breath, each heartbeat seemed to ripple outward, triggering subtle and then increasingly obvious alterations in our perceptions and bodies. Frostline was no longer merely a facility. It was an agent alive in intent and indifferent to our presence, orchestrating subtle torment. Sparks was first. At first, only his reflection acted strangely elongated, fractured, multiplied in metallic surfaces. But soon his movements no longer aligned with the commands of his own will. He swung a tool to inspect a conduit. The arm swung wider than physics allowed, bending unnaturally mid-motion. He stumbled backward, catching himself against the wall, but it wasn't gravity. Something unseen had tugged at his limbs. His laughter, once nervous, became jagged, distorted, as if multiple voices echoed through him simultaneously. Every equipment check he performed now produced anomalies. Explosions muted yet echoed, lights flickering in impossible sequences. Sparks had become a partial extension of the base itself. Yael felt the changes differently. Her medical acuity, once precise, meticulous, and reliable, began to fracture. Measurements on instruments contradicted her instincts. She could not trust her own eyes. Blood pressure and oxygen readings indicated normality, yet her mind catalogued impossibilities. Vitals inconsistent with physiology, organ functions that defied biology. She attempted a diagnosis on herself, only to realize she could no longer reconcile her knowledge with reality. Past procedures and years of experience melted into incomprehensible, jumbled fragments. Lyre's transformation was subtler, insidious. The frequencies he monitored, once a tool, now flowed through him. He became a conduit for the base's signals. The hum, once perceptible only as background resonance, now pulsed in sync with his heartbeat. Communication devices fed erratic data through his neural patterns. When he spoke, words fractured, syllables repeated, distorted, layering into patterns that suggested messages from entities beyond comprehension. He no longer required external devices. The base spoke directly, and he responded unconsciously, in kind. Commander Barak struggled visibly to maintain composure. Rational, seasoned, disciplined, he recalibrated readings and rechecked environmental scans, but he was slowly unraveling. Shadows moved in concert with his perception, and angles bent when he tried to measure them. The more he tried to assert control, the more he realized that the very physics of the chamber obeyed neither protocol nor understanding. His hands trembled when handling equipment. His rational decisions became guesses, guided more by instinct than logic. Dov Levin, the veteran, was last. Memory, once a tool for precise tactical advantage, began erasing itself. He followed orders, navigated corridors, and responded to commands, but the events leading to each action became fuzzy, unattached to cause. His experience, his instincts, his identity as a leader slowly dissolved, leaving only a functional shell capable of motion and compliance, but unaware of why he acted. Even I, documenting everything for personal and operational logs, felt the creeping influence. Peripheral vision flickered with shapes moving at impossible angles. The hum resonated in my chest, adjusting subtly to my own breathing. Glyphs along the walls pulsed in response to my gaze, and every entry I attempted in my journal warped. Letters shifting as if the base itself opposed accurate documentation. By the end of the sequence, we were 6 operatives, physically intact, but perceptually fractured. The environment had redefined us individually. Sparks as partial extension of the facility. Yao as a mind scrambling across impossible data. Liar as a conduit. Barrick as a rationalist losing the ground beneath his logic. Dov as a compliant shell. And I as observer and recorder under relentless cognitive assault. The chamber had taught us a lesson. Frostline did not merely contain anomalies. It created them. It reshaped reality around its inhabitants, bending flesh, mind, and perception. Resistance was possible only in fleeting rational moments. Every instinct, every protocol, every training exercise was meaningless against an intelligence unconcerned with human limits. We were no longer merely exploring. We were being cataloged, adapted, observed, each of us subtly redefined, preparing for consequences we could not yet comprehend. And the entity, the patient, indifferent presence, remained, watching, waiting, and calculating. By the time we reached the central chamber, the facility's apparent nexus, the base had ceased subtlety. The hum was deafening now, resonating through bone and blood, synchronized with every heartbeat, every exhalation. Shadows no longer lingered. They lunged, stretching across walls, floor, and ceiling in impossible geometries. Sparks moved first, reaching toward a cluster of glyphs pulsing brighter than any we had seen. His body elongated, fingers bending as if he were a puppet in the hands of the base. The light of the symbols reflected in his eyes, and for a heartbeat I swore he was not him anymore. The laughter that followed was jagged, multi-layered, emanating not from him, but through him. Yao's instrument screamed contradictory readings. Oxygen appeared adequate. Vitals were normal, yet her mind cataloged impossible anomalies, tissues that shouldn't exist, heartbeats that overlapped in time. Her gaze flicked to the entity, a towering figure, elongated, glowing faintly green, arms bending at impossible angles.
It did not move conventionally, yet its presence was inescapable, pressing into our senses. Folding corridors around itself like origami, Liar's body twitched subtly in sync with the entity. Frequencies passed through him, emitting pulses that we could perceive as both sound and thought. His voice fractured mid-word, layered with static, as though he were simultaneously speaking in multiple dimensions. He turned, eyes wide, and whispered, "It's mapping us, through us." Commander Barak barked orders, attempting to reassert control, but the laws of physics obeyed the facility, not him. Walls stretched and contracted, the floor tilted imperceptibly, shadows converged toward him. He tried to stabilize the team, but reality had already fractured around us. Every step forward required negotiation with impossible geometry, every breath drawn in a medium that resisted understanding. Dob followed mechanically, obeying commands, but no longer recalling why. His memory, once a reliable guide, had been excised, leaving only reflexive competence. The chamber pulsed in rhythm with his steps, glyphs glowing brighter, as if acknowledging his functional obedience. I observed, documenting, recording the sequence with trembling hands. The entity shifted closer, though its motion defied observation. One moment a meter away, the next seemingly 10 meters, then collapsing the distance impossibly. The hum became tactile, pressing against my chest, manipulating perception of distance, time, and mass. Then the breach occurred. A section of wall rippled, bending inward like water, revealing an aperture that should not have existed. Sparks vanished into it partially, limbs elongating into the void, his laughter echoing from multiple directions. The hum intensified, and we understood escape was no longer possible, yet survival depended on moving through the anomaly. Time fragmented. Clocks contradicted themselves. Shadows fell in impossible directions. The entity's gaze or its equivalent followed us into the aperture. Forward was imperative. Backward impossible. The chamber folded upon itself, corridors looping infinitely, yet simultaneously compressing. In that final instant, each of us was redefined, perception manipulated, limbs reoriented, consciousness stretched. Rationality, training, and courage were inadequate. We passed through the breach not by choice, but because the base and its entity demanded it. And as we emerged, the first real measure of consequence became clear. What lay beyond would irreversibly alter each of us, individually and collectively. Frostline had completed its assessment, indifferent, patient, and absolute. The exit hatch loomed ahead, barely visible through the shifting shadows and distortion of the final corridors. We moved as one, each step heavy with exhaustion and disorientation. Time no longer flowed linearly. Our watches contradicted each other, some spinning backward, others skipping forward in violent leaps. The hum of Frostline persisted even as the chamber behind us faded, as if the base were breathing in anticipation of our departure. Sparks was first to stumble, his elongated limbs, partially redefined by the entity, caught on nothing, swinging unnaturally before he corrected midair. Yale grabbed him, steadying both, her own mind now scrambled with impossible medical data. Lyre emitted low, electronic pulses instead of words, resonating in synchrony with the fading glyphs, acting as an unwitting guide through distorted space. The hatch opened onto the surface, but the Arctic night had changed. Colors where impossible shadows shimmered in unnatural hues. Auroras formed patterns that defied explanation. The snow glistened with metallic luster, crunching beneath our feet in an irregular rhythm. My lungs burned with the metallic taste of air, and I realized the base's influence had not ended. It had followed us, bleeding through the threshold. Time outside was no solace. 14 hours had passed below Frostline according to internal recording. Outside, only 20 minutes had elapsed. We blinked, disoriented. Sunlight tore what we perceived as sunlight-cast shadows at angles that contradicted geometry. The wind carried low-frequency vibrations, subtle but perceptible, each gust whispering names and partial phrases we recognized. Commander Barak tried to assert rationality. "Keep moving," he ordered, voice tight. Yet even his authority faltered. The landscape around us shifted subtly with each step. Footprints sometimes appeared before our boots touched snow, sometimes after, and at times vanished entirely. The base's anomaly seemed to have extended its domain, bending perception and physics beyond the facility itself. We regrouped near the convoy. Snowcats were operational, yet gauges displayed conflicting readings. Fuel levels fluctuated. Thermometers contradicted reality. Compasses spun erratically. Sparks hesitated, glancing back at Frostline. Even now, he seemed partially tethered to the entity, as if his body resisted leaving. Yale checked vitals, confirming each was alive, but alive was relative. Pulses, respiration, and oxygen appeared normal, yet cognition was fractured. We moved mechanically, following protocol to extraction, aware that rational understanding was a casualty of the base's influence. As we approached the transport, I noted the subtle distortions, shadows not aligning with light sources, snow glinting with unnatural reflections, auroras that hinted at geometries impossible in Euclidean space. Laia, now fully a conduit, emitted pulses in direct response to the alien resonance lingering above the surface. We all understood silently the environment, like the base, was patient. It had waited. We departed, yet the Arctic outside felt wrong. Colors, shadows, and perception itself had been permanently altered. Frostline had not merely tested us, it had rewritten the rules of interaction with the world. Every step forward was forward in body, yet partial backward in mind, as if leaving the facility only displaced our cognition from the baseline reality. And so we moved, extraction point ahead, senses betraying us, each aware that survival did not mean escape, only that the patient intelligence beneath the ice had, for now, permitted continuation. The moment we cleared Frostline, the team was physically intact, yet fundamentally altered. The base had not needed to attack it, had reshaped us in ways impossible to explain, permanent and individualized. Sparks was first. Alimhe's right arm was gone, severed at the shoulder without blood, pain, or warning. It simply ceased to exist, leaving an absence both physical and surreal. Yet he moved, operated tools, and followed commands with the remaining body. The base had rewritten his anatomy according to its own design, indifferent to human convention. Yael's medical knowledge unraveled. Years of expertise, detailed protocols, and diagnostic acumen scrambled into incoherent fragments. She attempted to assess her own vitals, only to find her understanding spanned centuries, species, and physiologies she could not reconcile. Her hands shook as she tried to stabilize herself and others. Her mind contained all knowledge, yet none of it was usable. Laia no longer spoke in human tones. Words became static and electronic pulses, his voice a vessel for the lingering resonance of Roswell. We could understand intent, barely, but meaning was fractured. His consciousness now functioned partly as a receiver, partly as the entity's conduit, translating its signals in ways that disoriented even him. Commander Baroque retained awareness, yet the principles that had governed his logic now bent unpredictably. Shadows followed him in angles inconsistent with reality. Light twisted around him. His decision-making was no longer rational, only operational. He remained effective, but incomplete, a commander in body, a fraction in mind. Dev Levin moved and obeyed commands, yet his memory had been partially erased. Orders executed without understanding, instincts acting without conscious guidance. The team relied on him to maintain formation, yet he existed as a hollow echo of the veteran we knew. I remained the recorder, yet my logs distorted despite effort. Glyphs in my journal shifted, letters recombined, timelines contradicted one another. Even documenting reality had become an exercise in futility. We regrouped at the convoy, each altered in unique, irremediable ways. The environment outside Frostline seemed slightly unreal colors, more vivid. Shadows misaligned, air metallic. Every breath reminded us of what had been taken and what had been imposed. Survival did not mean restoration. We had escaped physically, yet the base's influence had already reshaped our existence irrevocably.
Every step forward was a negotiation with these alterations. Each of us bore a permanent testament to the entity's patient observation, different calculation, and absolute control. Frostline had not merely tested. It had claimed extraction from the Arctic was uneventful in appearance, yet surreal. Base officers received us with calm efficiency, their expressions neutral, detached, no questions about altered limbs, scrambled cognition, or anomalous signals. Reports were delivered on schedule. Medical checks performed, yet sterile, impersonal, unseeing. Most was unnatural, almost rehearsed. We were escorted into the debriefing chamber, a minimalist room bathed in cold fluorescent light. Walls bore no markings, no instruments, just a single table and monitors displaying static and generic operational data. A senior officer, previously unknown, initiated questioning. Questions were procedural, formulaic, times, movements, compliance with protocol. Details of anomalies, entities, or glyphs were ignored or subtly redirected. When I attempted to describe the events, the distortions of space, the whispers, sparks vanishing limb, the officer paused briefly, then smiled, almost imperceptibly, and said, "Document your observations for the sanitized report. Leave subjective anomalies aside." Words themselves seemed to warp in my mind, twisting rational recollection into bureaucratic compliance. Notes altered spontaneously on the digital recorder. Glyphs embedded in my handwriting shifted into innocuous numerical data. The base's influence extended beyond physical extraction. Y'all's fractured medical cognition was normalized in the debrief, yet internally scrambled. Lyre's voice electronic, fractured, was transcribed as communication errors. Commander Baroque's indecipherable. Calculations were logged as standard operational notes. Dov Levin, the hollowed veteran, responded automatically to prompts. Memory gaps excised from the record. Every anomaly we had witnessed was sanitized, reshaped to fit a narrative of routine reconnaissance. Files were sealed in non-existent archives. The officers insisted on confidentiality, citing protocol, national security, and operational discretion. Yet the efficiency of suppression suggested something deeper, institutional knowledge that exceeded even classified manuals. My testimony, intended as permanent record, transformed under observation. sentences rearranging into meaningless, sanitized language. The truth attempted to assert itself, but the room, the officers, the very environment conspired to erase it. We were reassigned immediately after debrief. Each role aligned with our altered condition, Sparks handling infrastructure diagnostics beyond human limitation. Y'all placed in abstract research, her knowledge scrambled, yet exploitable. Lyra assigned to communication arrays, now a vessel for unseen resonance. Commander Barak moved to field strategy, rationality compromised but functional. Dovlevin retained in operational support, memory gaps irrelevant to protocol compliance. The message was clear. Frostline's effects were permanent, understood institutionally, and yet forbidden to document accurately. We survived, but survival meant assimilation into a system that would enforce the erasure of truth. Reality itself was sanitized, our testimony rewritten into lies we could no longer contradict. The Arctic, the base, and the entity beneath remained patient, indifferent, and untouched by human oversight. Even as I attempted to recall and write my own account, words resisted. Every description warped, every observation sanitized. The entity's patient, gaze indirect, but absolute remained, watching through institutional channels, awaiting the inevitable next phase of human hubris. I returned to my quarters, a small, sparsely furnished apartment above the city. Everything appeared ordinary. The hum of the heater, the flicker of fluorescent lights, the faint scent of antiseptic from cleaning, yet nothing felt correct. Shadows moved independently of the light, sometimes extending extra limbs, sometimes pausing mid-air before collapsing back into darkness. Electronics resisted logic. My laptop displayed containment logs I had never seen, countdowns that made no sense, and glyphs pulsing faintly on the screen as though alive. Even my watch betrayed me, minutes elongated, then skipped erratically. Shadows from the hands stretching in ways that contradicted physics. Every surface suggested movement just beyond perception, a patient awareness observing my every motion. I tried to write, to record testimony, to capture reality as I had seen it. Words refused to obey. Sentences twisted, letters shifted, glyphs infiltrating the margins of the page. Even ink seemed to resist permanence. Shapes formed, then collapsed into something else entirely. The room itself participated, walls subtly leaning, floor slightly rippling beneath boots, furniture rearranging imperceptibly when not observed. The air tasted faintly metallic. Breathing was laborious, the chest pressing inward, subtle but constant. I felt watched, not by a human presence, but by something deliberate, eternal, patient. Occasionally, a low pulse echoed in resonance with my heartbeat, as if the entity were reminding me it remained. Unthreatened, unconcerned, yet fully aware. From the hallway came footsteps, heavy, deliberate, far too weighty for a human.
Ow.
They paused, receded, returned, indifferent to my presence, as if testing perception itself. Electronics flickered, revealing alien symbols in brief bursts, unreadable but unmistakably alive. I knew now, survival did not grant freedom. Frostline had reshaped our minds, altered our bodies, and embedded its observation into the very fabric of perception. There would be no normalcy, no return. Even in the city, far from ice and steel, the entity lingered, patient, indifferent. I paused, pen hovering. The room, the shadows, the faint pulse in my chest all whispered the same truth. Reality was not ours to command. The entity does not need to destroy us. And humanity, in its relentless hubris, will finish the work for it.